In this episode, we're going to talk about exposure compensation. Exposure compensation is something that you use in conjunction with the priority modes, the Shutter-Priority and Aperture-Priority modes that we've covered in the previous episodes. It can be used with program mode as well, which we're going to talk about in the next episode. It's a way of overriding what the camera has chosen as the correct exposure. Remember, when you're in aperture priority, the camera's choosing the shutter speed. You can choose to use auto ISO or manual ISO. I want you in these exercises to use manual ISO, and we'll talk later about when auto ISO is really a good choice. So go outside. It's an overcast day, and hopefully the sun will not come in and out as much as it did in my last episode, and we'll stay somewhat properly exposed. But we're looking at a rose over here, and we're going to take a picture of that. So go to a shadowy area. This is the exposed area, but it's a little shadowy because of the day. Go to a shadowy area and set your camera to ISO 200 and aperture priority. So that's the A or the AV if you're on a Canon for aperture value. So I'm on A, and I have my aperture set to f8. So that's where we want to start. When I frame my shot, I'm at f8. It's giving me 1/30th of a second. And remember, if you look in your viewfinder, it's going to be similar to mine. It may be different in some ways, but there are three numbers. The first number on my viewfinder is in white letters, and that's the shutter speed the camera is choosing. And the next number is the aperture, the f8 that I chose. And the next number is 0.0, and that's exposure compensation. And to the right of that on my screen, it is the metering index we've talked about, and the little indicator is right at 0, which is, to remind you, is what the camera's trying to do. It's trying to get a correct exposure with balanced light. So I'm going to change my exposure compensation on my camera because I have two dials. It's the front dial. On your camera, it may be holding down that plus minus button that you used in manual mode to get aperture value. Hold down that plus minus button and turn your dial, and that's the way you change your exposure compensation. So we've got, it's showing me, as I said, and now it's gone down to 1/25th of a second, and I want it to be faster. Now a faster shutter speed is going to underexpose in this situation, so I'm going to underexpose by a -1. So I'm going to turn my dial so that 0.0 goes to -1.0, and that gives me a 60th of a second, which is really, that's a nice shutter speed. I could even go one more. Let's go -2. So let's take a look at that picture, and now let's try underexposing by 2 stops. So now it's giving me 160th of a second. Light just changed. And so the whole area looks kind of dark, but the rose is really standing out. I think I might like that one better than the first one. In any event, by using exposure compensation, I was able to override that aperture or that shutter value that the camera had chosen. And if aperture priority is what I'm really after, I mean, I want to control depth of field, then being able to change that shutter speed, and I don't want to go into manual, let's say, being able to change that shutter speed by using the exposure compensation is a really handy feature. Okay, I've moved around a little bit, so now we're looking over towards the garage, the white garage, and you can still see the rose here. So and I want to show you one other way that exposure compensation can be helpful. We don't have any snow, we're not at the beach, but I do have a white garage. But what happens oftentimes is if we take a shot, now let's see if I can get the flower in this as well. And I am at, let's see. I'm going to go to f11 because it is a little bit bright. What I want to do is show you that if I shoot at f11, it's giving me a shutter speed of 40, 1/40th of a second, and I've got that white garage behind as background. And if we take a look at that picture, notice that white garage looks like it's gray, because that's what your camera's trying to do. When it uses the meter and meters the whole scene, the whole frame, it's trying to get to an average gray, a medium gray. And so it'll turn white, kind of grayish. It'll turn black, kind of grayish. So I'm smarter than the camera in some cases. I need to overexpose. This is if you're doing snow pictures, and if you've ever taken snow pictures and you've found that your images, the snow look gray, that's not the way it really was. Or same thing at the beach, even though the sand is not white necessarily, sometimes it looks sort of white, but it gets grayish because the camera's compensating and underexposing. So I'm going to take sort of that same shot, and I'm going to overexpose by 1 stop. And let's see what that does to our white on the garage. It got whiter. If we compare it to the one before it, it definitely is whiter. But we could even go one more. So this probably is going to overexpose the rose too much. But let's go to a +2. And yeah, it's really overexposing the rose. But it'll also slow down the shutter speed. So if we look at that image, you'll see that, yeah, the rose is not even in focus actually, but it's overexposed compared to the one before it, but it's definitely whiter than the one before that. So that's another way that you can use exposure compensation. So those are the advantages of exposure compensation. There's the advantages and disadvantages. The biggest disadvantage with exposure compensation is if you set your camera, let's say we just did, to a +2, it's overexposing by 2. And if you're going to use aperture priority or shutter priority next time you pick up the camera, exposure compensation doesn't change when you turn the camera off. Exposure compensation is still going to be +2, and you'll take a shot not even thinking about it, and you'll have a way overexposed image. So you've got to remember when you're finished to go back in and turn your exposure compensation back to 0. And that is really the only disadvantage of exposure compensation. But thank you very much for checking in, and I look forward to having you join us in episode 17 when we look at program mode in learning photography.